All right. Thank you, everybody. Welcome, and thank you, everyone, for joining us for this Black History Month lecture with Dante King. My name is Melissa Bautista. I serve as the Assistant Director for the Multicultural Resource Center, part of the Office of Diversity and Outreach. And before we begin, I wanted to take some time to really honor and give gratitude to the Black History Month 2023 Planning Committee. This committee is comprised of both learners and staff who have dedicated and committed their time to volunteer to weekly meetings and really take on leadership to create these offerings for members of UCSF. And those organizations are the Black Caucus, BCH Oakland Black Caucus, the BCH Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Department, Black Excellence in STEM, part of the graduate division, Student National Medical Association, and the Student National Dental Association. So before we begin, the MRC wanted to just ground us some gentle reminders around Zoom protocol, just to ensure that the experience for all attendees is enjoyable. So there is a live captioning available in various languages, and you can also view the full transcript by opting into closed captioning at the bottom of your screen. Please note that the Q&A will be in a separate Zoom from 1 to 1:30, and we invite folks to join us in that session, and the invite link will be shared with everybody at the end of this presentation. And lastly, this will be recorded and it will be being made available to members of UCSF through the Office of Diversity and Outreach's website and newsletter. Okay, so I want us to take a moment before I to open the virtual event with a land acknowledgement. And this land acknowledgement was led by Dr. Tassi Bongiovanni, the Native American Health Alliance, and the Association of Native American Medical Students in collaboration with Ramaytush Ohlone representatives. The UC system is part of a public land grant university that has and continues to benefit from the dispossession of Native land that the Morrill Act of 1862 funded to create the University of California and campuses in which UCSF is part of. So it's important to name that at UCSF we are guests, and we would like to acknowledge the Ramaytush Ohlone people who are the traditional custodians of this land. We pay our respects to the Ramaytush Ohlone elders, past, present, and future, who call this place, the land that UCSF sits upon, their home. We are proud to continue the tradition of coming together and growing as a community, and we thank the Ramaytush Ohlone elder community for their stewardship and support, and we look forward to strengthening our ties as we continue our relationship of mutual respect and understanding. So a large part of land acknowledgements isn't only reading the statement, but it's about taking action and really engaging in critical self-reflection of what that actionable step is for you. So again, this was curated by the collective of Indigenous organizations at UCSF for us, right? And these are some just opportunities that maybe you all are interested in engaging with, and we encourage you all to just look through these resources and learn more about how maybe you can integrate land acknowledgement, the practice of land acknowledgement, and taking action into your work. So now I'd like to call on Alexis Cobbins, the co-social justice chair of the Black Caucus at UCSF and the executive director of the Preterm Birth Initiative, who will ground us in the theme of this lecture and introduce our speaker. Alexis?
Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's event. Before I jump into that, I also would like to ground us in an appreciation. This is a Black ancestor appreciation. Oh, bear with me while I try to figure out how to share my screen. I'm not as tech savvy as I used to be. And so I will read this and we can open with this Black ancestor appreciation, and then I'll launch into our theme and introducing our speaker. We acknowledge The exploitation of our Black ancestors who toiled on this land, building America's wealth and freedom, and survived despite never being compensated and being denied their sovereignty. While our ancestors have survived, we also honor and remember those whose legacies were cut short due to genocidal anti-Black violence. We are committed to repairing the harms caused by individuals, institutions, and the US government, and we honor the gifts, resilience, and sacrifices of our Black ancestors by protecting our spirits, seeking light and laughter, leaning into love, and investing in our collective legacy. This was adapted from the San Francisco Reparations Advisory Committee, edited by the Centering Black Women, Birthing People, and Families subgroup at PTBI, and revised by the PTBI Community Advisory Board. So our theme for today is thriving while surviving. This is also the theme for the 31st annual Black Heritage Gala being thrown by the Black Caucus, which will be on Saturday, February 25th. And I serve as the co-chair of the Social Justice Committee on the Black Caucus as well. And just wanted to say that thriving while surviving is more than just a theme to us. It's also a way of being and a way that we operate. It's an action that we embody, and we value this action. And so the Social Justice Committee has spent a lot of time supporting Black employees at UCSF, as well as supporting Black-led organizations in San Francisco. So for the past couple of years, we've provided financial support to Black-led organizations in San Francisco. We look forward to continuing this work. We also invite you to join us. And if that's something that you're interested in, please feel free to email me at alexis.cobbins@ucsf.edu for more information. And now I will introduce our speaker, Dante King. He's a native of San Francisco. He's an author of the book, The 400-Year Holocaust, White America's Legal, Psychopathic, and Sociopathic Black Genocide and the Revolt Against Critical Race Theory. Dante is also a professor of American history, African American history, and Black studies. His research interests include the intersections of race, racism, and legality throughout pre- and post-colonial America. Dante currently serves as guest faculty at the University of California, San Francisco School of Medicine, as well as at the Mayo Clinic. Dante is a historian, scholar, public motivational speaker, thought leader, facilitator, and coach. Dante has worked and consulted for more than 15 years as a human resource management professional, specializing in the implementation of anti-racist practice and organizational development and change. And what I can also say is that Dante has done a lot of work with us at the California Preterm Birth Initiative and really helped us tighten up and hone in on our commitment to not only anti-racism, but combating anti-Blackness and recognizing that as a root of the disparities that Black women are facing in birth outcomes. And so without further ado, I will pass it over to Dante King.
Thank you, Alexis, and thank you, Melissa. I'm very honored to be here, always humbled whenever I have an opportunity to share my work and also share spaces like this. And so I want to share the title for my talk today, as well as a video that's going to help to open things up. And so when I was invited to this talk, I was provided with the theme for this year's celebration, as well as the gala. So thriving while surviving. And I began to think about what that means in an orientation, in a culture and institutions that were built by white people for the survival and for the thriving of white people, and how we have been dominated as Black people, particularly as African Americans, throughout our history and to the present day, in terms of rulership, in terms of our cultural orientations, the legal system, and so on and so forth. And so one of the things that I came up with is divorcing from anti-Blackness, white normativity, and white ideas and white ideals, actually, as a way to thrive. And it's something that I've been practicing for several years now. And I encourage others to think about what I'm going to share here today, and also to take on similar practice.
Methadone. No.
Now, look, let's deal with our own historical naivete. Until we deal with it, we're not going any place. Black people have no right to expect anything from this establishment because it wasn't set up for them. They wasn't brought to this country to be given democracy. They was brought to this country to do some work, to labor and to obey. And once the machines made a whole lot of these jobs obsolete, it tended to make a whole lot of the people obsolete. Now, we keep worrying about the American promise and the American dream, and we forget it wasn't made to us. And the white man has not betrayed anything because he didn't promise us anything in the first place. Now, the role of institutions in a society is to reflect the power that controls that society. So we have American institutions arrayed against us, and we naively expect these institutions to reform themselves, because if they reform themselves, that's tantamount to presiding over their own demise.
I'd like to say one thing on that. I think the question you asked is how do the schools accomplish this? I mean, you were concerned about the process. I think we got to understand that there's no such thing as objective truth, which is implicit in everything Dr. Clark says. That white people use the institutions to accomplish white purpose. The white purpose is to maintain a power position and keep everybody else in a subordinate, powerless kind of position. Now that's the institution's purpose, and that's the way it functions and how it functions. And we got to realize then that everything that the schools teach is designed to fit into that purpose. The schools teach not objective truth, but what the white man wants to project as truth. Now that's from the very kindergarten right straight on through.
For example, what?
Sociology. Sociology is not a science in the sense that it's dealing objectively with the way people live together. It's dealing with the white man's pattern of living together as the norm by which we judge how other people live. If you live like white people live, then you're living the way you are supposed to live. If not, you're either primitive or insane as a people. Psychologically, it's the same thing. Psychology does not deal with any objective kind of discussion or development of how people live or analysis of how people function as individuals, but how does the white man function? If the white man does it this way, then this is the norm by which we judge all other people. If the white man is violent, then actually all people have to be violent to be normal. If you're not violent, obviously there's something wrong with you and you should be in an insane asylum. The whole pattern that's set up as a norm for human behavior by psychologists, the whole library full of it. Psychiatrists, everybody that's dealing with it is dealing with it from a white point of view. So they teach white children, black children and white children, to look through white eyes. From the kindergarten on, the black child is beginning to look at the world and interpret it through white eyes. Everything he is wrong. Everything that exists in his community is wrong. And we ought to declare that white music really is no good, that white psychology is no good. The white man either acts like we do or he's insane.
All right, and so what does this mean to divorce from white normativity and the white psychology and white cultural ideals and so on and so forth? So I'm going to share briefly about history, and I'll first go to Cheryl Harris's work around whiteness as property. One of the things that she says in this paper is that whiteness is the most valuable property that a person can have in America. It's worth more than money. It's worth more than any asset that one can possess. And she also talks about whiteness being established for the purposes of both racial exclusion and racial subjugation. So the inherent need to be able to oppress and or to have others to oppress so that your culture, your political systems, your educational systems, and so on and so forth have value, so that your community has the most supreme value of all. And it's much more complex than that. So I invite you to take courses that I teach on this subject, because you'll have more of an opportunity we will have more of an opportunity to go deeper upon these or on these concepts together once in terms of having more time. Okay. And so when we look at, for example, white Western world scientific and academic philosophies that emerged during the 19th and 20th centuries, you have, for example, Orson Fowler and Samuel Wells, who were the recognized leaders in the phrenological, physiological, and hygienic sciences for over 50 years, okay? And so Samuel Wells, he established the science of physiognomy, which was the practice of assessing a person's character or personality from their outer appearance, especially the face. And so he came up with a book called New Physiognomy, which I just flashed on the screen. And this is what he proposed in terms of this new science. He says, bearing in mind then its limitations and modifications, it is well in all cases when making a physiognomical examination to observe the facial angle. Figure 142 will help to convey an idea of the different grades of development and intelligence as indicated in the profile, size, as well as form being taken into the account. And so this science, for example, this academic greatness that you see here before you was espoused as, the top, phrenological, the top anthropological science of the day or philosophy of the day. You also have Madison Grant, Dr. Madison Grant, who was an anthropologist who was a great influence on Adolf Hitler. He says, whenever, and this is from his book, The Passing of the Great Race, that was published in 1916. He says, whenever the incentive to imitate the dominant race is removed, the Negro, or for that matter, the Indian, reverts shortly to his astrograde of culture. In other words, it is the individual and not the race that is affected by religion, education, and example. Negroes have demonstrated throughout recorded time that they are a stationary species and that they do not possess the potentiality of progress or initiative from within. Progress from self-impulse must not be confounded with mimicry or progress imposed from without by social pressure or the slaver's lash. Mistaken regard for what are believed to be divine laws and a sentimental belief in the sanctity of human life tend to prevent both the elimination of defective infants and the sterilization of such adults as are themselves of no value to the community. The laws of nature require the obliteration of the unfit, and human life is valuable only when it is of use to the community or race. He says a rigid system of selection through the elimination of those who are weak or unfit, in other words, social failures, would solve the whole question in 100 years, as well as enable us to get rid of the undesirables who crowd our jails, hospitals, and insane asylums. The individual himself can be nourished, educated, and protected by the community during his lifetime, but the state, through sterilization, must see to it that his line stops with him, or else future generations will be cursed with an ever-increasing load of misguided sentimentalism. This is a practical, merciful, and inevitable solution of the whole problem, and can be applied to an ever-widening circle of social discards, beginning always with the criminal, the diseased, and the insane, and extending gradually to types which may be called weaklings rather than defectives, and perhaps ultimately to worthless race types. This doctrine that I'm sharing with you, and these are just a few examples, I go through a litany of them in the courses that I teach, but these types of scientific academic philosophies led to the Supreme Court decision in 1927, Buck v. Bill, which permitted the compulsory sterilization of the unfit, including the intellectually disabled, for the protection and health of the state. And Chief Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, he goes on record, he says, it is better for the world if instead of waiting to execute degenerate offspring for crime or to let them starve for their imbecility, society can prevent those who are manifestly unfit from continuing their kind. 3 generations of imbeciles are enough. And so this rationale, this doctrine was used to support the enactment and the emergence of state-sanctioned eugenical sterilization boards that appeared in every state across America, all over this country. And you can see here from this article, the eugenics, forced sterilization, as well as the campaign to get rid of the unfit and undesirable was supported by people such as John D. Rockefeller, Andrew Carnegie, Alexander Graham Bell. And so America was all bought in. And so later on, when Hitler says, I've studied what the United States is doing concerning the prevention of reproduction by people whose progeny would in all probability be of no value or injurious to the racial stock. And he adopts such philosophies, and specifically the book that Madison Grant published, and he goes through and commits the acts that he committed over in 1930s and 40s Germany. This is a widely accepted academic and political principle. This is widely accepted by members of the white organization, i.e. white people. And this later leads to standardized testing, or this actually emerges in the early 20th century in 1908 and 1911, but these are the inventors of the IQ test. And so the development of children in children. And so these people are regulating not only what knowledge is, but what intelligence is, and who's intelligent versus who's not intelligent. And so one of the questions I began to ask when I was invited to do this talk is, or was, what new anti-Black and white Western world scientific and research methodologies are being developed and or used present day to evaluate Black behavioral, intellectual, and social patterns? And I'm going to share with you some more recent and current day examples of how this has continued to flourish over time. And so understanding, before I do that, understanding that we exist in a not just a white supremacy or systems of white supremacy, but in a culture of white supremacy that is held up by white ideals and white ideas. And there are so many of us as Black people and brown people who have accepted these and embraced these white ideals and ideas to begin to evaluate and validate ourselves as well as others. And so understanding that whiteness is a political organization created and structured for the purposes of power, supremacy, domination, exclusion, and oppression through legal, social, cultural, psychic, emotional, economic, and all other institutional power and control mechanisms, and that it encompasses the vilification and villainizing of people considered non-white and most severely humans labeled as Black people and or African American for the purposes of spiritual, emotional, psychic, economic, physical comfort and gain. Understanding this in its fullest capacity or to the fullest magnitude, how can Black brilliance and or Black people, our fullest potential, ever be recognized inside of a culture that was built on our oppression? And so I am asserting that Blackness or the brilliance or Black excellence cannot be found or located through white ideals and white ideas. And yet that's all that we know, because we've been dominated by white culture, by white institutions, by white ideologies, by white definitions of intelligence, and even understanding what knowledge is and what knowledge is valuable versus what knowledge is not valuable. And so we see here in 2023, we have a presidential candidate, Nikki Haley, calling for competency tests for politicians over 75 during a campaign launch. And when you really understand what this is, it's like, who are the experts on competence? And I think a clearer question is, within the white cultural framework and white idea, Of course, that is white people. But I think as Black and brown people, what we need to begin to do in order to thrive and thrive fully is begin divorcing ourselves from these white ideals and ideas that stand to continually and perpetually do harm to our minds, our psyches, our emotions, and our spirits, and our physical person. And so we have, for example, anti-Black allies who align with white supremacist ideologies, social and intellectual patterns about Black people. It's not just coming from white people, but a culture of people who have been trained to think of Black people in a deficit or through a deficit-based orientation. And so we saw this with our former LA City Council person, Nuri Martinez, where she calls her former coworkers or colleague's son a monkey. He's like a monkey. She says they're raising him like a white kid, implying that this little Black child doesn't deserve the freedoms and flexibilities that non-Black and white children are raised with in America. We also see it from our current school board of education member, Ann Sue, who basically espoused that, it's the lack of family support for Black students, for Black and Hispanic students, unstable family environments caused by housing and food insecurity, along with the lack of parental encouragement to focus on learning. She says that causes havoc and problems in the classroom for teachers. And this is mere ignorance coming from a person who's accepted a set of white ideals and principles that have been widely circulated in this culture, as well as an ignorance of history to understand all of the institutional and structural mechanisms that have been set up to create all of the Black ghettos and what they used to be called were slums, but understanding that it was policy and practices such as the two Supreme Court decisions of 1926 that called for or allowed the emergence of racial restrictive covenants, as well as racial zoning ordinances to become the legal practices of the day throughout this country, and how these ghettos have been set up and how Black people have been locked out of economic opportunity in this country, as well as all other opportunity. But it doesn't just come from, white presenting Latinx or Hispanic people or East Asian people who have been prioritized in this culture historically and ongoing, and I would say definitely for the last 50 to 60 years above other people from the Asian community in America, but it also comes from Black people as well. And so you see here this example presented by Tarek Ali, who's a social media influencer. He says on Twitter, "One thing I hate about dark Black women is they always loud and smell rank. If I did date females, Black bees would be the last thing." And so this cultural psychology of anti-Blackness, one that in the 70s, Dr. Alvin Fusani says, I think we need to understand that white racism and inherent within white racism is anti-Blackness. He says, I think we need to establish that white racism is a mental illness. Many white social scientists would like to define racism as something that is normal, as a cultural variant. As long as we approach it that way, we really don't deal with the pathology of racism itself. It's like saying that cancer, because a lot of people have it in this society, is somehow normal. And I also want to position anti-Blackness in that way as well. I think we need to start thinking of anti-Blackness as a sickness. And I name it as that in my book, as psychopathic and sociopathic. And I'll share a little bit of that framing in just a moment. But anti-Blackness is a white American legal, social, cultural, economic, institutional value and belief system. So we are saturated with it. It's in everything. It involves the deprioritization of humans labeled as Black people, as well as the criminalization, hypernegativity, hyperscrutiny, and negative positioning of Black people and or Blackness throughout all aspects of American society and life for the purposes of justifying and rationalizing debasement, inhumane treatment, ultimately genocide. And so we are socialized and trained with innate psychological and emotional reflexes and impulses that react and respond negatively to Black people, especially Black people who do not conform to and or emulate whiteness. And so this encompasses holding Black people to the highest possible standards, while white people and people from groups that have been minoritized as model minorities are many times held to the lowest possible standards and or no standards at all. It also encompasses the ways in which there are cultural competences and beliefs in the presumed superiority and or competence of white people, where while there is a presumption of guilt and deficiency and insufficiency in Black people. And so we saw this with the Yale preschool study, where they told them at a big conference, there were pre-K teachers, and they recruited 135 educators to watch a few short videos. Here's what they told them. They told them that we are interested in learning about how teachers detect challenging behavior in the classroom. Sometimes this involves seeing behavior before it becomes problematic. The video segments you are about to view are of preschoolers engaging in various activities. Some clips may or may not contain challenging behaviors. Your job is to press the enter key on the external keypad every time you see a behavior that could become a potential challenge. Each video included 4 children, a Black boy and girl and a white boy and girl. Here's the deception. There was no challenging behavior, but you have roughly over 40% of the teachers who saw challenging behavior in the Black boy, or they focused their attention on them. So it says, what we found was exactly what we expected based on the rates at which children are expelled from preschool programs, Gillum says. Teachers looked more at the Black children than the white children, and they looked specifically more at the African-American boy. Indeed, according to recent data from the US Department of Education, Black children are 3.6 times more likely to be suspended from preschool than white children. Put another way, Black children account for roughly 19% of all preschoolers, but nearly half of preschoolers who get suspended. We also saw it in the legal memo study, where they told 2 different control groups that there was a legal memo that was written by a third-year law student named Thomas Meyer, who was Caucasian, and another to the other group, the same thing, third-year law student who wrote the memo but was African-American. His name was Thomas Meyer too. Here were the findings. The exact same memo averaged a 3.2 out of 5 rating under our hypothetical African-American Thomas Meyer and a 4.1 out of 5 rating under hypothetical Caucasian Thomas Meyer. The qualitative comments on memos consistently were also more positive for the Caucasian Thomas Meyer than our African-American Thomas Meyer. And again, this is a hypothetical study that was done. And so for Caucasian Thomas Meyer, you see here, they said that he was generally a good writer, but needs to work on X. Has potential, good analytical skills. For the African-American Thomas Meyer, needs a lot of work. Can't believe he went to NYU, average at best. And you also see some additional feedback here. Same memo, but different findings, because they were, again, hyper scrutinizing, as I say in my definition around anti-Blackness, the African-American Thomas Meyer. And so this is a built-in psychology. And so one of the things, and I'll just say this here before I move to the next example, is we have to stop seeking validation and using the validation mechanisms that white people have developed, including the grading system and rubric, how we understand what knowledge is, how we understand what intellect is. We have to stop using those mechanisms to validate ourselves. And we have to divorce ourselves from the system, its ideologies, because all of these things, I believe, have been instituted. And in our progress, let me finish my thought. They've been instituted to drive us crazy as Black people and to make us feel like we have to continually prove ourselves when there's nothing to prove. We're brilliant from the moment that we are conceived, and we're brilliant when we come out the womb. Our problem is anti-Blackness and the oppression that we face. And so and I'll just share a little bit from my own personal experience. I found myself in my early 40s in the chair of a therapist, wondering what was wrong with me. I'm doing everything that this society has told me to do, and I'm still experiencing anti-Blackness through these systems. I'm experiencing it from people who look like me. I had a Black boss, and she was the worst because she had accepted these principles and standards as the norm. And they really are damaging. And so you see this guy, Mr. Blum, who's responsible for the affirmative action case that went before the Supreme Court last year, where he used a bunch of Asian students to allege that they weren't getting into certain Ivy League universities because of Black students. Because Black and brown students, Black and Hispanic students were being admitted on the basis of affirmative action, and that they were actually taking their spots. And so I just want to play a little bit of a clip from that case that went before the Supreme Court on October 31st, 2022. And this is Chief Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson challenging the legal counsel for UNC. So I want you to listen, and then I'm going to just reinforce what was shared here.
Justice Jackson?
Can I just quickly return to Justice Alito's hypothetical, which I think is a little bit helpful in trying to pinpoint a problem that I've been having. It seems from the race hypothetical that if there was only one basis for giving someone a boost, and that basis was race, then I see disadvantage absolutely to anyone else who's not an underrepresented minority who can get that boost. But I understood that we have here a program in which there are at least 40 different bases for being able to get a boost. And not everybody who is an underrepresented minority gets a boost. So it's really hard to figure out if anyone is being disadvantaged in a system like that. And that's where I was worried about standing, because I'm trying to understand how the system is operating to actually advantage minorities in a way that is harmful to anyone else in this system.
Yeah, and I think that attributes to the careful cue that UNC has taken to this court's decisions in Fisher 2, making sure universities find themselves in this Goldilocks problem about.
So I'm going to pause it. And then one of the things I'll say, and then I'm going to go back to it, is that she's challenging this whole idea that people who are being admitted to these universities on the basis of affirmative action are the reason, or are the reason why opportunities for these East Asian students who are bringing forward their concerns, whether that is the reason. She's saying that there's over 40 different reasons or 40 different justifications that can be used to provide someone with the boost, such as you have people who don't deserve, white children who may not deserve to go to that school, but because their grandparents went there and there's a grandfather clause or a legacy clause that they may be admitted. And so she's saying, how can we say that it's affirmative action when there are so many? You've got people's families who may give a donation. These people may not have the pedigree or the GPA based upon white standards to enter into this university, and yet they're getting in. So I'm going to go back to it.
Considering it too much or too little, the university.
But there are other considerations, is the point. Everyone can get a boost for all sorts of reasons. Minorities don't automatically get a boost under this system, so it's hard to know whether anyone's being disadvantaged from the mere fact that a minority could get a boost in this environment, right?
That's right, and the evidence also bears it out at Petition Appendix 78, where the evidence showed that hundreds of white students with lower combined GPAs and SAT scores were admitted ahead of higher performing Black students, Latinx students who went to UNC. And I think that
So what I want you to notice is that what the UNC representative stated was, here you have hundreds of white students with lower combined GPA and SAT scores, which are the standards that are used to get into these colleges. And the focus is on the Black and Latinx students who are somehow taking away from the admissions potential of these East Asian students. And what's so interesting is that the East Asian students' focus was on the Black and Hispanic, per the white supremacist guy, Neil Blum, who was sponsoring them to bring forward this case. And yet there were no considerations in terms of the ways in which white mediocrity and white deficiency prevailed throughout this dynamic. And yet these students who were admitted to these universities, to these colleges, were stifled due to that. And so I think it really brings into full view that, again, we can be doing everything that we need to do to try and comply with the forced assimilation, manipulation, and deceit, which is a part of our cultural existence in America. And yet it still be weaponized against us. And that weaponry is never turned the other way to interrogate, white mediocrity or the deficiency of, maybe there were East Asian students that weren't performing or weren't as qualified as these Black and Hispanic students. And so we even see it, for example, in corporate America. You have Charles Scharf, who's the CEO of Wells Fargo. He says, while it might sound like an excuse, the unfortunate reality is that there is a very limited pool of Black talent to recruit from. And so inherent within this idea that there is a limited pool of Black talent is that the majority of Black people just aren't capable and competent. That's why we don't have a lot of representation within our organization. That's why we failed to promote them. It has nothing to do with the ways in which we've been, quote unquote, psychologized to view Black people, and nothing to do with our anti-Blackness and the way that we don't interrogate, again, white mediocrity or white deficiency. It's that Black people are deficient. And so you can see here, for example, this is just an example that I quote in my book. This guy, John Cochran, he says, I was a teacher for 17 years, but I couldn't read or write. He says, at teacher conferences, my teacher told my parents, he's a smart boy, he'll get it, and they moved me on to the 3rd grade. He's a smart boy, he'll get it, and they moved me on to the 4th grade. He's a smart boy, he'll get it, and they moved me on to the 5th grade, but I wasn't getting it. And yet his teachers continued to espouse that he was a smart child. And what I want you to think about, Black people and allies of Black people who are on here, is how many Black children do you know who, in the face of their inability to read or write or to, do well in a math class, that it is still maintained that they are smart children? And I want you to think about what is afforded to people who have non-Black skin in this country, and particularly white people. And it goes back to Cheryl Harris's, work on whiteness as property, that it is the most valuable property. He talks about how he belonged to a fraternity that stole exams, and he cheated. He even broke into his teacher's office to steal the case that the exams were locked in. He stole the answers to the exam, and he got another key made to open the drawers that the tests were stored in. And then they put the drawers back once they had copied the test, and how he felt so good about it. And I want you to think about, just in this one example, not privilege, because it's more than privilege. It's more than privilege. It is just an infinite amount of power that is afforded to the white race, and how they not only can maneuver and excel within these organizations without being required to be excellent or great, and yet will still receive an abundance of reward and opportunity, but how they can literally get away with things and not be held to any standards. And I even call into view what's happening with the investigation into our former president, Donald Trump, and his previous administration, and the number of passes that are being given in this moment, or the lack of a forcefulness around bringing indictments. I go to Carl Rittenhouse, who was acquitted of murder over in a trial over killing 2 people in Kenosha, Wisconsin. This was a few years ago. I also bring into view Judge Spare's man and teen rape case. Christopher Belcher, he pled guilty and admitted to the sexual assaults of 4 young women. And the judge said that he actually prayed over what the appropriate sentence was, and he didn't think that prison was the right choice. Instead, he gave him 8 years of probation. And so what does it really mean to thrive when you are under the social, legal, political, educational, cultural, and institutional control of another group? And Malcolm X put it this way. He says, when you are in your own nation, in your own land, you're in a position to get justice. But when you're in another man's country, in another man's land, under another man's flag, under another man's government, and under another man's court system, you have to look to that other man for justice, and you'll never get it. And so I'm going to, in closing, play a quick video by my dear friend and sister, Dr. Caretha Mitchell, in a conversation that she had with Larry Favors Daniel some months ago. And she's talking about how whiteness is never neutral.
Something you'd said the last time you were here, that if it weren't for their whiteness, if it weren't for their white maleness, would they sit in that seat? And I've incorporated those thoughts a number of times. And I will ask myself, if you weren't white, would you have this position? And then I flipped it. I said, well, if you weren't Black, how much more would you have had access to? And those types of stop myself in the moment, ask my question, it really helps me to sort of recalibrate where I'm at in whatever situation it is. And it helps me to really remember that we are dealing with some things that we have been taught to keep in the back of our mind, but should actually be at the forefront. And all of that was bubbling in my mind before we got to the appointments or the nomination of one Ketanji Brown Jackson to the Supreme Court. And you know, this is going to be a case where we have all types of questions about meritocracy, qualifications. Is she really as qualified as she should be? Was she an affirmative action pick? How does white mediocrity and know your place aggression show up when we are assessing the legacy of Ketanji Brown Jackson and what our hopes for her will be as she hopefully will ascend to the Supreme Court?
Yeah, it's going to play out as it often does, which is that so often what happens is really, really sneaky, partly because all of us have been trained to bring out really high standards when the person is not a straight white man. And so part of what I like to have us do is really be on guard for when we have extraordinarily high standards for Black women in these kinds of positions, because those standards can often become a kind of bludgeon. I mean, if I take it out, there are a couple different ways you have me thinking about this. One way is, you know, as a professor myself, part of what I guard against myself is when I get extra disappointed when a Black student hasn't read in my class African-American literature versus a white student. I recognize that as an unfair standard, not unfair standard, but an unfair disappointment. Taking it personally is a problem because my taking it personally is about me holding them to a certain standard because they're Black, and a white student just gets to be a student. Part of what I want us to get in the practice of doing is recognize that whiteness is never neutral. It is unfairly advantaged. And so whenever you pretend that it's neutral, you're ignoring the way that there's an unfair advantage. So with the Supreme Court example that you're using, if we act as if being a white person is a neutral thing, then we overlook all of the unearned advantages that came with being white for all of those predecessors. We overlook the way that they didn't have to be exceptional, that they were given exceptional opportunity even if they weren't exceptional. We could even uncover all the ways that our educational system is advantaging white children from the playground, right? So it's like, if we act like whiteness is neutral, we're already bludgeoning everyone who's of color. So I just want us to get really used to paying attention to the unearned advantage of whiteness that makes it such that every time they're hired, for example, they're hired in a cluster. They get to come in with a whole group of people who are believing in their success, believing in their right to belong. They get to enter into a workplace where people naturally mentor them and don't see it as mentoring. They just see it as being a good colleague. But when I show up, all of a sudden, if they're mentoring me, they're giving me some kind of special help or something. No, they're actually usually resistant to mentoring me and making sure that I can be set up to fail. So I just want us to get really, really practiced at noticing how whiteness gives unearned advantages, and those unearned advantages turn into a bludgeon against people of color.
Right.
The benefit of the doubt that you get when you are white, the benefit of the doubt that leads to 4th, 5th, and 6th chances, the benefit of the doubt that doesn't, like, all of those benefits of the doubt based on nothing but whiteness translates into a bludgeon for people of color. And I want us to get really used to noticing that, because then we will notice how easy it is for us to be extra angry at Black women for every little thing. I want us to start recognizing that as part of the aggression. And
so, you know, I'm going to close, but I also want to just put out here for your use and reference, along with my book, The 400-Year Holocaust, Dr. Mitchell's paper on identifying white mediocrity and know your place aggression, a form of self-care. Because understanding the ways in which the system and the ideals and the educational constructs in this culture have been established and set up to as a weapon against Black people, you know, it has been so rewarding. It has been so enlightening and so fulfilling to be able to get to a place where I understand that these tricks that are played on us as Black people, and to be able to divorce myself from this very treacherous value and belief system and culture that really figures me out of it. And so Dr. Bobby Wright, one of the things that he wrote in the 70s, and this is part of the philosophy that I share in my book, in terms of looking at the legal, psychopathic, and sociopathic Black genocide and white supremacy that arose in this culture that really is the bedrock of this culture. He says, in their relationship with the Black race, whites are psychopaths, and their behavior represents an underlying biologically transmitted proclivity with roots deep in their evolutionary history. The psychopath is an individual who is constantly in conflict with other persons or groups. He is unable to experience guilt, is completely selfish and callous, and has a total disregard for the rights of others. One of the best methods that can be used to measure the psychopathic traits of the white race is observing and analyzing their universal overt behaviors and attitudes towards Blacks. Psychopaths simply ignore the concept of right and wrong. By ignoring this trait in the white race, the lack of ethical and moral development, Blacks have made and are still making a tragic mistake in basing the worldwide Black liberation movement on moral suasion. It is pathological for Blacks to keep attempting to use moral suasion on a people who have no morality where race is the variable. And I share this and not just so much about white people, because there are so many of us who have accepted these ideals and react and respond to Black people in the same way. I shared slides that reflected this in terms of Ann Sue, Nuri Martinez, Tarek Ali. I know myself, I was raised with a set of anti-Black ideals that I have to continue to fight and push against. And so what does this mean about Black American people who have been dominated by these white people in American society? And I think 1 + 1 = 2 on this. If they have programmed themselves and established every institutional, educational, and cultural mechanism to establish a sort of psychopathic and sociopathic nature towards Black people, I want you to pay attention to the interactions that Black people have with other Black people. And Dr. Randy Bourne, he talks about terrorism being a gradual process. But Sage Howard, she said in a recent article, she says, I grew up in a household where our American dream was Black excellence. On the surface, Black excellence is simply the celebration of the success of a Black person. At its root, however, it measures a person's ability to attain mainstream white standards of success despite facing constant adversity. As I understand it now, Black excellence means adhering to respectability politics, a deceptive vehicle that measures my worth by standards set by white men. And so how do we as Black and brown people use white normativity and white standards to otherize and inferiorize each other? And we do this most severely to Black people. I'm going to close with a few quotes. Dr. E. Franklin Frazier, in his work around the Black bourgeoisie, this is in 1957, he says, and he's talking about the Black middle-class people who are on this campaign for progress and acceptance in American culture. He says, since the Black bourgeoisie live largely in a world of make-believe, the masks which they wear to play their sorry roles conceal their feelings of inferiority and the insecurity and the frustrations that haunt their inner lives. Despite their attempt to escape from real identification with the masses of Negroes, they cannot escape the mark of oppression any more than their less favored kinsmen. In attempting to escape identification with the Black masses, they have developed a self-hatred that reveals itself in their deprecation of the physical and social characteristics of Negroes. Likewise, their feelings of inferiority and insecurity are revealed in their pathological struggle for status in the isolated Negro world and craving for recognition in the white world. Their escape into a world of make-believe with its sham society leaves them with a feeling of emptiness and futility, which causes them to constantly seek and escape in new delusions. I was going to share some additional quotes by Dr. Jerome Fox. But again, what does divorcing myself from white normativity and white ideas and ideals look like? Not holding Black people to any standards of white morality. The practice of not holding Black people to any standards of white criminality or legality. The practice of not holding Black people to any standards of white intelligence, ways of knowing and making meaning. Relinquishing all value and attachments to white normativity for as much as I can, understanding for as much as I can all the ways that Black people are harmed mentally, emotionally, and spiritually through forced assimilation into and manipulation within American culture. And so please, if you can, also access Dr. Jerome Fox's book around, it's a workbook around Addicted to White, the Oppressed in League with the Oppressor, because he takes to task all the ways that Black Americans have also bought into these practices and these cultural practices, the institutional frameworks and practices, and how we are really taking part and participating in the genocide of Black people. And so I say to that, what does it mean to thrive? And we each have to decide what that means for ourselves. But for me, it means divorcing from whiteness and also anti-Blackness, and really continuing to investigate what those things are, what that means. So I'll end there. Thank you. I will see you over in the Q&A. Thank you so much for all of the love. I really appreciate it. So I'm going to go over to the Q&A.